Hi, Sunday, September 22nd, 2024. We are jumping into the middle of the book of Acts today, Acts 14, verses 8 through 18. In Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as Paul was speaking, and Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed, and he called out to the man, "Stand up on your feet." And the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in their local language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Barnabas, who was with Paul, they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas. When Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human, like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. John Wesley was the founder of Methodism, and he kept a diary. In 1738, his entry was, "The morning, May 7, I preached in St. Lawrence's, was asked not to come back. The evening, May 7th, I preached at St. Catherine Cree's church. The deacons said, 'Get out and stay out.' The morning of May 14th, I preached at St. Anne's. Can't go back there. May 21st, in the afternoon, I preached at St. John's. Kicked out again. On May 21st, in the evening, I preached at St. Bennett's. The deacons called a special meeting. I can't return." 1 year later, John Wesley entered in his diary, "May 8th, afternoon, I preached in a pasture in Bath, and 1,000 people came to hear me." September 9th, a couple months later, I preached to 10,000 people 3 weeks in a row in Moorfields. 3 years later, 1742, March 10th, I preached in a meadow today. I was chased out of the meadow as a bull was turned loose there during the services. Can't go back there. Sometimes people don't get where you're coming from. Sometimes they don't understand. Sometimes they downright reject you. And it can lead to discouragement. And discouragement comes in a lot of forms. A comment or a song, a news story, the crawl at the bottom of our TVs. Sometimes the highest of highs can give way to the lowest of lows in an instant. Notice that in his diary, Wesley didn't say how he felt about what he experienced. He just kept writing and kept preaching. Paul is the person, Lystra is the place. There was a man who lived there who had never walked. Some things went down, and some people saw it, and they didn't understand. Paul really is the reason that we probably have a Christian church. He didn't get everything right. He said some things that some of us wish he hadn't said. He did some things that some of us wish he hadn't done. But you can't say he didn't try. And you can't say he didn't work hard. Because of Paul, the story of Jesus got a foothold in those early days. He preached in Asia Minor and Europe. He expanded the gospel far outside of where it had been. He wrote to all these churches to check on them, to answer questions, to chastise them, mostly just to love them. 14 of the 27 books in the New Testament are attributed to Paul. And I think that how he was received, for the most part, was pretty well. The Roman authorities didn't like him so much because he was a threat, and they thought they'd taken care of that with Jesus. But almost half of the book of Acts talk about where he went, how he traveled, preaching, performing miracles, giving encouragement and direction. Remember, Paul was not one of the 12 disciples. He was a Jewish leader who actually persecuted a lot of the early followers of Jesus. And then he had this lightning bolt conversion experience traveling. It temporarily blinded him, but permanently opened his eyes to God. And after that, he was a tireless missionary. He probably traveled over 10,000 miles if you map it all out, mostly on foot, some by boat, through modern-day Israel, Syria, Turkey, and Greece. He walked the roads that were built by the Romans, preaching against the Romans. It was crowded and dirty and hot, long distances at a time. There weren't really hotels or rest areas to pull off of the paved road. Traveling by sea wasn't comfortable. There were no cabins for travelers. You just had to find a place on the deck, and you're exposed to the sun and the wind and the rain and everything else. In 2 Corinthians, Paul describes the dangers of all of his travel. 3 times I was beaten with rods and kicked out of the towns that I went to. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a day and a night I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, danger from rivers, from bandits, from my own people, from Gentiles, danger in the city, in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, Paul writes. Through many a sleepless night, hungry, thirsty, often without food, I was cold and naked. When we complain about air travel or road construction on the interstate, Paul has a word. He made all these missionary journeys, extended trips to share the gospel. He felt compelled to tell his story. He took people with him, usually Barnabas, like in today's story. And they went to kind of a remote place, Lystra. They spoke different language there. Started in Syria, went to the island of Cyprus, back to the mainland, Perga, Antioch, Lystra. And in Lystra, they're going into the city, and they encounter this man who'd never walked before. And Paul healed him, and it got noticed. When people saw it, they started shouting at Paul and Barnabas in their different language, and Paul and Barnabas did not know what was happening. The gods have come down to us in human form, they yelled. Gods, little g, not capitalized. If you interviewed people on the street of any city and asked them, do you believe in God? You get yes, you get no, you get But nobody's going to ask you, what do you mean by God? Or which God are you talking about? Because modern humans presume there's only one God. Most of human history, though, that would have been a big assumption, that you would worship only one God. Why would you limit yourself to just one God? There are so many. So Paul and Barnabas walk into this diverse religious environment of the expanded Roman world. And these new Christians they were trying to talk to didn't understand. Pagan religions at that time had a lot of gods, little g's. But early Christians believed, like our Jewish partners in the faith, that there's only one God, one living and true God, God with a capital G, creator of the universe, the seas, and all that's in them, says Paul. It was usually his practice, going into a city, to first go to the synagogue and preach there, and after making people mad about it, he'd go deeper into the city and get a crowd together. But there's no mention of a synagogue here. There's just this encounter with this man who couldn't walk. And maybe there were no Jews there. Maybe there was no synagogue. We don't know. It doesn't say. But Paul and Barnabas were in unfamiliar territory, and the people there did not understand. In fact, they started worshiping Paul and Barnabas after he healed the man. They worshiped Zeus and Hermes, and here they are in the flesh. Paul and Barnabas were in the DC comic universe, and they wandered onto the set of a Marvel movie. They were not understood. Zeus and Hermes were Greek gods, and Paul and Barnabas healed the man, and now they're the stars of the show. The locals think they are the embodiment of their gods, the biggest gods. In fact, the priest of Zeus thinks that Paul and Barnabas are his people. So they bring in the oxes, they start trying to sacrifice, and it took, because of the language barrier, a minute or two to see what was happening. But when they did, they tore their clothes, a sign of humility. People, why are you doing this? We're mortal, just like you. Turn from all these worthless things to the living God. But even in all the chaos, Paul somehow rises above it and makes this into a teaching moment to say this word about God, tailoring his message to this new audience, this audience he doesn't know or understand. And before he can tell them to understand who he is, he has to tell them who God is. Turn to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. Apparently, it didn't do any good. It didn't change their minds. It didn't stop them. Unlike other places in Acts, when it says thousands were added to their number, in Lystra, not so much. The last verse in the story says of Paul and Barnabas, even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifices to them. The people did not get the message. It's going to take more than just one Sunday school lesson for this crowd. Sometimes it's daunting, people coming to a new faith, to understand everything all at once. There are language barriers even now. We can all be speaking English, but we start using words like doxology and anthem. We tell people to turn into a book called a hymnal, and they read language there like thee and thou. The things we assume are so universally understood, and the things we assume are true, even the things we reject, define our faith, and it's all different to somebody who's new. I'm encouraged by this story because Paul starts with the basics. He just jumps right in with the most foundational thing. There is one God, and that God has love for you. God has love for you and the world, for you and your neighbor. The language isn't the barrier for God. Only your thinking is. Now, part of the story we didn't read was that when the people there in Lystra realized that Paul wasn't the God that they thought, they took him outside the city and tried to stone him. They made the mistake, but he paid the price for it. His supporters surrounded him, helped him, and they continued their road trip to the next town, probably skedaddling pretty quickly. Perseverance, grit, determination, commitment, all of those things came into play. To persevere is to persist in anything undertaken, to maintain a purpose in spite of difficulty, to overcome an obstacle or discouragement, to continue steadfastly. Have there been times in your life when you've had to hold on? I remember a poster hanging in my sister's bedroom growing up with a cat hanging on a branch. And the little inscription says, "Hang in there, baby." It's what we do. Sometimes people don't understand, and we have to tell them again. We have to stick around and stick with our story. Sometimes we have to just stay in the fight. Wesley, in his diary, despite years of discouragement, he experienced enough discouragement to chase away the most persistent of people, but it wasn't enough. He persisted. He fixed his eyes on the things that he thought God wanted him to do, and he chased after them. And thankfully, it wasn't enough for Paul and Barnabas to just say, "We're done, we're out, we're getting away from this." Their experience in Lystra might have turned them off, but instead they just kept going. There might be a word for us in this. Loving and serving God can be hard. But notice who was there for them when the situation turned awful. Their friends, their people, their community. Where'd they come from? They just appeared in the story when Paul was getting stoned by these people who rejected him. And they picked him up and they carried him to the next town. Their friends were there. The difficulty of being faithful can make unintended outcomes, even danger. And there are no guarantees. There's a likelihood that loving God can be messy or uncomfortable or worse. As we continue to try to learn how God wants us to live and how we can receive God's love and be in partnership with God, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we don't understand, and sometimes other people don't understand us. Maybe it's good news, though, that God can be glorified in the messiness. Maybe it's good news that our community, our people, can hold each other through the frustrations of life. Maybe it's good news today that no matter what external things threaten us, block us, hold us, hurt us, shake us, scare us, God promised to stay with us no matter what. Sometime later, after this Lystra experience, Paul wrote, "Let us not grow weary in doing what's right, for we will reap at harvest time if we do not give up," says Paul. "Just keep swimming," says Dory. "I love you and I will never stop loving you," says God. Hang in there, baby.